Hey Sarthak,
Yes.
what did one microservice say to another?
You're gonna make another lame joke, aren't you?
Yes, I am. But don't you want to know?
Tell me.
Why are you so restless?
Do you want to add something to that, or are we done here?
We're done here. Welcome back to another episode. In this episode, we're gonna be breaking down microservices. But before we head in, I'm Soumya. I'm a software engineer. I mostly work on cloud networking and
I'm Sarthak. I'm also a software engineer. I mostly work in orchestration. I do dabble in web development a little bit, but more on that later.
okay. So we chose microservices today, right? It's a hot and heavy term again. We hear this term being thrown around IT industry all over. So we thought it would be a good idea to, maybe just go over, this define this thing for people. So what do you want to talk about in today's episode?
I mean, as you said, microservices is definitely a very loaded term. And I feel like it is a topic that is widely used in interviews also for people in system design. It is something that people encounter in their daily lives if they're not working on monoliths in general or like offline stuff in general. So I felt like this is a topic we should discuss about early on so that we can, like get some knowledge out of both of us, like understand some of the overloaded terms, how interviews shape them, and just in general help people answer questions on microservices.
I agree. Yeah, it's a good topic to do. But now that before diving into the details of it, do you want to start it like really simple and talk about what is a microservice?
Well, as you said, the term is overloaded, but I think in its essence, a microservice is just a service which has a single purpose, right? And it's going to be a part of a single full architecture, but it on its own it is just serving one purpose. How do you define it?
So I would say if you had to like define it as such, picture something like building like Legos. You take like multiple pieces of Legos and you combine them together to make like a brilliant structure, right? Whatever shape you're building. So each Lego piece can be a microservice, right? Each piece there serves a function, does something, it has a purpose to be there, but together it forms a complete application by interacting with each other.
Yeah. So before we get into the nitty-gritties, do you think it's important we tell like how much experience we have with microservices just to set context?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So I can go first.
Yeah.
I have worked almost all my life in microservices. In the different jobs I've had, and even in the current job, our architecture is heavily microservice oriented, and it's as it should be in any big company. I think it just makes you iterate faster. We'll get to all that. But what about you?
I think it's similar for me. Even though there are downsides that I wouldn't call what I work on a pure microservice architecture, because there are things that one process has become too big, and we'll get into all that later. But for most of the part, I think I also have a clear function of I work on the stack, and all of the components of that particular cloud stack are each of them being a simple microservice.
Okay, so let me ask you this: in your daily, ownership of components in your job, how many microservices are you or your team is owning in general?
I think currently we own about 3. Yeah, with my current project, I think we own about 3. What about you?
We have a distributed system. We work on distributed logic, so we have around 12.
Oh, wow.
In our architecture, and some of them are huge. Some of them are so simple that they can be an API and another microservice, but that's something else, right?
Yeah.
So so like pretty diversified system, I would say.
Yeah.
With 12 microservices. Yeah.
So do you think before we also discuss like monoliths and microservices and everything, do you think as a new joinee, if somebody comes into your company today, is it easier for them to understand that there are so many services around and how they interact with each other, or do you think that overcomplicates things for them?
I think it definitely makes it easier because whenever you join a company, be it a fresher or someone else, you are going to be given a project, and I think microservices enable you to ignore everything else and focus on the service you're making the change in, because that all you need to do make sure is that that contract is maintained, right? Which is the API which is talking to other services. So I think it makes it easier there. But what about you? What do you think?
I think from a technical perspective, I do think it definitely makes things easier for people to understand. But I think it also becomes a hit or miss sometimes because people then sometimes miss the whole business logic of it, like how everything comes together to build something together. But I think good engineers are able to grasp that too.
Yeah.
So
No, but that's actually a good point
Yeah.
because in my experience, I have seen freshers struggle to understand how all these components fit together.
yeah.
And sometimes you have a microservice which is doing the job for 4 other microservices,
Hmm.
and you don't even know that. You think that this is the main component here, so I'm gonna modify it here
Hmm.
with respect to that component. But then you realize that there are 2 other services that are calling this,
Exactly.
and then all hell breaks loose.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, all in all, I think but technically, I think it definitely makes it easier. That
Yeah.
you just have to work on this piece and
You just
it's
weigh
easy.
the pros and cons.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So now that we have covered introduction and stuff, I'm gonna give you like a very overloaded question.
Mhm.
Is monolith bad in today's world?
I would answer this in a different way.
Hmm.
I think monoliths get unnecessary hate in today's world. Okay, so if you actually sign off on a monolith, or if you say that this is not that bad,
Yeah.
people are gonna come at you like with pitchforks, like how dare you say
How
that,
dare you say that?
right? So
Yeah.
I definitely think they get unnecessary hate, and
Yeah.
there is a right balance to be
Hmm.
had. But I'm curious to hear your opinion.
I agree too. I think if your service is small, it does like limited number of things, then I don't think you have to overcomplicate it by breaking it down into microservices.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that also goes into the defining microservice, right? Do you agree with the notion that there's a notion that is called as like single responsibility for a
Yeah.
function for a microservice,
Yeah.
right? Where it should have a single responsibility. I want to hear your view on that. What do you think about it?
So I see single responsibility as more of one business function, right? I think people confuse it like, hey, if I'm authenticating a user, I'm just gonna, create a whole new microservice for it. But that does not, I don't think I see single responsibility as that way. I think if you have to handle like user sessions, authentication, creating new accounts, whatever it is, it has to be one microservices. Basically, handling users is a microservice, right? Instead of like breaking it down into even further chunks. Like one business function should be one single responsibility.
I agree, and I think that's kind of highlights the trade-off I mentioned for monolith and microservices also. Is because if you break it too much, you're actually gonna incur a latency of network calls, because ultimately these microservices are communicating via network calls, right? And network calls have latency. They are gonna take, even if the hosts are next to each other, it is never gonna be as fast as when it's running in the same host.
Exactly.
So if you break it down too much, you might incur the cost on that side.
Yeah.
Right. So I totally agree. Single responsibility should always be looked from a business point of view as much as possible, and not from a purely technical point of view.
Exactly.
But the tech part still stays. It's the balance that you need there.
The tech part stays in the sense that if like I said, like handling users is supposed to be different microservices. When you go down to code it, maybe you will make different classes for things, right? You will have authentication as one class, you will have user as another class. So that class can still have a single responsibility, but the whole service as a thing should serve like one business principle.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So not to put you on the spot or anything, but can you think of like a case where we can maybe think of examples where like monolith might actually be better over microservices?
That's a very vague question without like kind of knowing the specifics. But I think I can give a abstract answer here. Like there's no specific case that I have personally encountered. Like there's always this thought that okay, this might have been better as a microservice. I would have had that more freedom here. But I think ultimately in cases where you don't want complexity, okay, but it's not something that will scale out of like it's a very fine balance. You can opt to add another responsibility to a microservice, right? And that's kind of how you walk the path to a monolith, I guess. So I'm not sure what I'm answering, but again, as I said, it's a fine balance, right? So if you're adding that level of responsibility, another responsibility, knowing well that if it is an independent microservice, it will be a more overhead. That is the case when I think monoliths actually can work, alright? And of course, there are other reasons for it also. If sometimes like I work in distributed systems, and we have some microservices which we call super services, not microservices anymore, because they're just doing so much for us.
Yeah.
And the speed we get by running all these in the same host, is unmatched, because memory is always going to be faster than network calls, right?
Exactly.
And we need in the context of what we do, we need every millisecond of latency to matter, right?
Exactly.
We need that data processed as fast as possible. So those are the kind of questions I would say you need to ask to determine whether Monolith is better for you or Microservices is better for you.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, but I think we have confused people here. They'll be like, why are we talking about converting a microservice to Monolith?
Yeah.
So I think we should spend some time talking about the cycle of what microservices and Monolith looks like, so that people get some context here. So do you want to start it?
So a monolith is basically just huge chunks of code. All of it is like in a single service. It does multiple functionalities, and that's your whole application.
You change one thing here, something else breaks
something
there.
else breaks there, right? That is what a monolith is. With microservices, like we talked about, they're like just services interacting with each other, all come together to form a common goal.
Yeah.
But the cycle that unknowingly, or if you don't pay close attention to your architecture, what you may end up doing is that you will bloat your microservice so much that each of those services become kind of like monoliths.
Yes.
Because you did not pay attention that, hey, my microservice was doing function A and function B, and you kept adding function C, but eventually it just becomes too bloated, and that is what you were calling
so that's
as
a cycle,
super service.
Yeah. So that's why you need to be very careful about adding an operation every time, because before you realize it, you'll have a new monolith on your hand, which you still call a microservice, but it is a super service
at this point. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's a fun point. But do you have any notions or caveats that people can pay close attention to? I mean, I think all this is like very vague and generic, but are there like some good practices that people can follow when they're trying to design a microservice and they don't bloat it up too much?
Yeah, I actually follow one advice a lot, and that is, so most of your business decisions from day to day, or technical decisions from day to day, you don't have to think about it, because if you have designed your microservices right, they will just fit in. Like you know that, oh yeah, this is something that needs to change in this service.
Exactly.
This is something that needs to change in this service. But once in a while, you will get a decision where you have to kind of think. For example, like currently I'm facing a decision at work where I need sub-millisecond latencies.
Oh wow.
Okay. And even the current architecture, I'm not able to get it. So I am kind of thinking to evaluate. Now I'm evaluating whether this should be a new microservice for us, right? So with some other tech stack maybe. So once in a while when you get that decision, the question you need to ask yourself is this something that other things can use in future cases? In that case, maybe you should split it out and make it an independent, component or a microservice.
I agree with that. Yeah, I think extensibility is the term we're looking for. If there are more use cases for the same functionality, then you obviously need to split it to a different microservice, right? What do you think about like a good design for a microservices? Like, I'll give you an example. Like, I think how you design your microservices really depends on the API contract you choose to interact with other services, right? The more generic you keep it, the more efficient and more extensible it will be eventually. Do you have some add-ons like that?
Yeah, so your point is pretty valid, but I'll also add one more thing to API contract here. Apart from generic, which means basically it should be able to handle as many cases as possible in one contract, you also need it to be deterministic.
Yes.
And now what I mean by that is, let's say you have an API contract where you're taking a bunch of properties, okay, about some component A of your business logic. Now, there are two ways you can take these properties. Way number one is that you have a map and you let the users decide what properties they want to send as key value pairs, and you accept it on your side. The second way is that you define each and every property individually in the field, and you use like the customers will come and set each of those properties, and you utilize it here, and if you want to add a new property, you go and add a new property there. I have seen a lot of ideal engineers take the approach number one because it is the more flexible, it is the more idealistic, but it is not maintainable. Okay, if you see like I can link some examples maybe in the description.
Yeah.
Okay, of famous open source projects which went down the path one, but they actually suffered because things become too generic, too non-deterministic, not generic. It can lead to confusion and like very very complex use cases emerging very very fast.
I mean, there's like with the first design, there's also obviously a simple choice, right? Like you've simplified things at the client side, right? For the person who's initiating the request, that you can make it generic and you can just fill up the key value pairs. But on the server side, each of the key values that you get, you need to add some logic there, right? So eventually it just becomes more complicated.
Yeah. So you're basically, for that API non-deterministic values, you're adding complexity on your server side. You're adding complexity on the users of the API.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and eventually it will just become, I mean, there are other things. The more code you add, you might end up making it like slower in response then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, just to highlight one point here, API contract is the first and foremost thing that determines how your microservice looks to others, and you should make sure that it is thought out for it's future proof.
It's future proof.
Right.
Yeah.
And another like hint that I use here is that if you cannot fit a new function in your microservices API contract, maybe it's a sign that it should be in a separate microservice. That's also a kind of a hint you can use.
Yeah, or you need to think harder. Two of those things.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, after you think hard, if you arrive at this situation. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's good. The other thing was, I think, single responsibility principle is something that we also mentioned earlier. I think that is the core most thing that defines what should be a new microservice and what should stay in the existing one. So, do you have any more things to add there?
No, I think this is it. We do want to do one episode on more details of microservices, I guess, which will, more than a podcast, I kind of want to talk about nitty-gritties.
Yeah.
And probably that will come out in the future, so they can keep an eye for that.
We really want to cover like examples of designs and stuff there. Yeah. So
but let me tell you one thing here. We have been talking about a lot of pros of microservices.
Yeah.
Should we go into some of the disadvantages?
Just gonna ask you that.
Okay, so you start.
They're expensive, right? I think the first one that comes to my mind at least is that they're expensive. Maintaining a monolith, deploying a monolith is cheaper than running like multiple services parallelly, right? That is one. What about you? Do you want to add more?
Yeah, I definitely have. Like there are definitely a lot of cons to microservices also. Okay, no architecture is perfect, and I think one of the biggest flaws, which I think currently has improved a little, but I'll talk about the original flaw, is that network calls happen over protocols which are meant for customer-facing interactions, right? So HTTP, for example, is one of the most famously used protocols for microservices interaction, right? Specifically for REST services. Now you have more protocols which I'll come to.
Yeah.
But these protocols are very hard to model data between microservices interaction. So there's a lot of serialization and deserialization happening over the wire, which kind of adds to the complexity, unnecessary complexity.
Yeah.
So that's one con I always think. Things have improved now. You have RPC protocol, which is much more
things
simpler.
like gRPC and everything has simplified that a bit. Yeah.
But it's still a protocol, right? So you still have to serialize and deserialize. I believe that serialization and deserialization step adds decent amount of complexity for people trying to get into these kind of architectures. You have complex, like I would say, monoliths of libraries doing serialization and deserialization right now, right? Jackson comes to mind. So that's one of the biggest cons, that you have to be ready for that. And I would say if you're in the process of creating microservices from your monoliths, and you have a team, get them started early on serialization and deserialization.
Okay. Another con that I think of, which I think some people might not agree with, is the testing part of it. So people really believe that, I've seen a lot of people really believe that microservices make testing very easy, right? Because if you're one microservice, you can just mock what the other service will send you and do things with the output, right?
No, I totally agree on this.
But in real world, that is so not the case. You don't know how the other service is going to behave. So I think having like integration test kind of developer pipeline is like really hard with microservices.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. People the example you gave, people use that example a lot, that you can just mock the response. But like there are things you cannot mock.
Yeah.
For example, in case of failure, you don't know what their retry strategy is.
Yeah.
You don't know how you handle retries. Do they know or not?
Exactly.
Right. So these kind of things lead to insanely unpredictable outcomes in case of failure scenarios.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a very good point.
Yeah.
Testing is easy on the upper level.
Yeah.
It's like you can unit
I would
test
say,
whatever
like,
you want.
yeah, exactly. I was gonna say, unit tests, writing unit tests is like the easiest thing ever. But like having those integration tests is like almost nearly impossible.
So you have to spend dedicated effort.
Yeah.
Probably if you're a engineering manager, you also have to appoint like a team just to kind of work on that, or you have to take out time, dedicated time from each and every engineer to maintain all this. Yeah.
Yeah. So what are the other pro cons that we can list about microservices that
I think it also hinders communication. Okay, for microservices, like, so the whole point of microservices is that you want to scale independently, right? But that kind of sometimes means that teams stop talking to each other. And I have seen that when that happens, there will be like abstract borders between teams that start to surface in the product. And a good example of this is a product of my ex-company. Okay, I don't know if I should mention the product or not, but I'll tell the problem.
Okay.
So in that product, for the customer side, we had like 7 tabs. Okay, and those 7 tabs were owned by one team each.
Okay.
And each tab had like 4 or 5 microservices behind it.
Okay.
When you transition from one tab to another, you can feel that the product has changed a little, like, and it won't be very drastic. It's not like the UI itself will change, but how when you type, the suggestions are coming. Are they coming much quicker? Are they coming much more intelligent? The search indexing, small things here and there have changed, which will make you realize that it feels a bit different.
Yeah.
Right. And that is happening because teams are siloed because of microservices, and they're not talking to each other about the whole product in general.
I agree with that. I think that's the thing. Like when you have too many microservices and too many teams, it's just harder to create that one holistic view, and customer experience can,
go for a toss. So that is another con that comes.
Yeah.
And I think it comes at the cost of scale. So again, it's something to weigh in accordingly to what your need is.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So anything else that you want to add before we go?
I think this is all. I think this was a good conversation. I think initially for microservices, I enjoyed the initial discussion and deep dive here. We'll probably come back to this topic again. So
of course, it's not as simple as just.
And I actually want to explore more dedicated designs, right? I want to. I think in future maybe we can come up with some Spotify designs, or take some service out there, Netflix, break it down into microservices. We can actually have some good discussion on them. We'll schedule some future episodes on that. What do you say?
I think that's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for watching. This is Version Control. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.
Bye bye.